Buenos días a todas.
Good afternoon to you all, and welcome to the second part of this doctoral seminar that discusses peace and European values as a potential model for integration and progress in a global world within the European Award, Charles V Award, granted to Sofia Corradi. Our next speaker will be moderated by Professor Bussier. He's Jean Monnet Chair at University Sorbonne 4. He's also a member of the jury of the Sofia Corradi Mama Erasmus grants, and he was one of the founding fathers of this project, of these scholarships that are linked to the Charles V Award, together with this doctoral seminar that we have organized for a few editions. Eric, thank you very much for being here with us. It is always a pleasure to have you among us.
C'est aussi un plaisir, grand plaisir. So we have a very important subject this afternoon because we are going to speak about external frontier of Europe with FRONTEX, and Maria Teresa from the University of Córdoba is beginning a thesis about this subject. It's the first year of this thesis, and it is one of the first time she has the opportunity to develop her subject. So I hope the discussion will be very profitable for her, and you will be able to give her some new ideas and opportunity to develop his work. So, Maria Teresa.
Thank you very much, Professor Bussier, colleagues, professors, members of the organization. Good afternoon. My name is Maria Teresa Acosta. I am writing my PhD on the University of Córdoba in EU law, more specifically on the European Border and Coast Guard. And this is where I will base my presentation next. The specific topic of my talk is from FRONTEX to the European Border and Coast Guard, towards an integrated management system for external borders founded on the values of solidarity and respect for fundamental rights. I think that nowadays the EU is facing one of the most important challenges of its time because of an exterior problem, which is the migratory crisis that is putting in danger some of the values of the EU, like solidarity, for instance. So I would like to show you what are the problems and the consequences of the migratory pressure, and what are the solutions that have come from the EU. I would like to begin my presentation with these slides. This is an article from a Spanish newspaper, El Mundo, according to which Austria is moving tanks towards the border to block the immigrants that come from Italy. This is from the 4th July 2017. My question is, how have we reached this point? How have we reached the point where two member states, EU member states, are using the military in order to prevent free movement between borders? In order to answer this question, here is the index of my presentation. First of all, I would like to discuss the migratory crisis of the Schengen area. So let's remember what Schengen area means and how has migratory crisis affected free movement of peoples. And then we will discuss what have been some of the solutions suggested by the EU. There was an attempt to set up an assessment system of Schengen, and we have created a European reinforcement of the European Border and Coast Guard. Last but not least, we will see whether these things that have been done by the EU, whether these solutions have respect the values of solidarity and protection of human rights of the European Union. We'll finish by some conclusions. Let's start with the Schengen area. The recognition of the freedom of movement had first an economic character, so there was a free movement of workers, of goods, services, and capitals. But it was not understood as free movement of people, right? It was just economic nature. Thanks to the EU court and some directives from the 90s, the subjects that could benefit free movement were more and more. It was not just workers, but also pensioners, dentists, and students. So we saw that some more people were granted this right. By the end of the 80s, there were still some physical borders among EU member states, so free movement of people was not a fact. Some countries like France and Germany decided to sign in 1984 some bilateral agreements, the Schaerbeek Agreement, where they tried to control the borders between France and Germany, and that was the seed for the Benelux that suppressed the borders among Germany, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. These 5 countries in 1985 signed the Schengen agreements. They tried to make border controls easier, and on the long term, they decided to eliminate borders among these countries. However, since national borders were being eliminated, they wanted to have some compensatory measures in order to improve legal police cooperation and have a common migration policy. All of these regulations conform the Schengen acquis. So by the 90s, we had 2 different regulations. We had the European one, the common European one, that had not been well developed, and the Schengen one that was much more advanced. This was finished with the Amsterdam Treaty, where the 2 regulations for free movement were consolidated, and the Schengen acquis became part of the EU law. So the whole of Europe could benefit from what Schengen had. Here you can see Schengen area made up of 26 states. Most of them are EU and Schengen states, but then we also have Ireland and the UK that are outside of Schengen. And then we have some Schengen members that do not belong to the EU, like Switzerland, Liechtenstein, or Norway. And then those in yellow are candidate countries to be members of the Schengen, like Croatia, who are members of the EU. The Amsterdam Treaty also created a space for freedom, security, and justice, so that there was also some police, legal, and migration common policy in order to also have control of outside borders. So, in 2011, we have the migratory crisis that began when thousands of irregular immigrants went from Tunis to the Italian island of Lampedusa. Faced with this situation, the Italian government asked for help to the EU so that they could relocate those African immigrants that were arriving to Italy. First, the EU didn't do nothing, and so Italy gave a residence permit to these immigrants, and so they had the rest of the Schengen area open to the immigrants. Faced with this situation, the French country did not agree, and so they reestablished their border control with Italy so that no irregular migrants would get into France. This is a possibility that was given by the Schengen area. When public order asked for an immediate action, then the recipient country can reestablish the borders for no more than 10 days. And that's what France did in its border with Italy. Here is the image of how migratory flux were in Europe. There were no national borders. What were the solutions of the EU in order to avoid this bilateral conflict between Italy and France? Well, first of all, the solution that was decided was to create a system of assessment and reestablishment of outside borders. So to speak, they tried to punish a little bit Italy for not having control the outside borders well, but they also tried to have a reestablishment of border control so that EU members could not unilaterally reestablish its borders, but it was done by through a recommendation of the EU Council. Probably this was just an emergency situation rather than a long-term solution, because at first the best thing probably would have been to reinforce borders instead of reestablishing national borders among member states. However, as we see, this was the first measure that was taken, and then later on they tried to reinforce this integrated management by creating this European Border and Coast Guard. So we had what they call the system of assessment, the Schengen system of assessment. So if there was any migratory crisis like the one that happened in Italy, it did not have any repercussions on other member states. This was done by experts in border control of the Schengen area. So they would draft a report that would assess the situation, and it could be okay, not okay, or that it needed improvement. After that, it would go to the European Commission that could also bring some recommendations. I would like to show you a practical case. It was the case of Greece in 2015, November. According to the assessment, the yearly assessment, this assessment committee, they analyzed the borders of Greece with other countries. The result of this report was that Greece was not complying with Schengen regulations because it was not doing a good management of outside borders. Among some of the things that they said is that they did not identify or have good fingerprints of immigrants. They did not check their travel documents, etc. Those were some of the difficulties. Some recommendations were also done. They said that Greece needed to improve the places where registration was done. A risk assessment system needed to be drafted, an improvement of infrastructure, etc. So there were many recommendations. Greece launched an action plan. However, when the Commission went once again to Greece in order to check whether things were being done, they said that they were not enough, and the door was open for the rest of the countries to be able to open to reinstate their national borders. This is something that we're going to discuss. What do you think that other countries did while this assessment was being done? I think that nobody waited for an assessment or a recommendation or non-positive results. They did the same as France with Italy. They reinstated their borders with Greece. Here you can see another piece of news. Germany reestablishes the border control in order to hinder refugees from getting into their country. And this was in 2015 when the assessment was being made. They did not wait in Germany, they just reinstated their own borders. And by that, instead of using the new tool, they did use the old mechanism, which you can see in the image. That is, after this assessment committee has visited the country, Schengen can recommend the reinstatement of national borders for 6 months and then an extra 3 months. This mechanism was used, but they had already been taken unilaterally, and the Council approved what individual countries did. And this has been extended 3 different times. So for a year and a half, there has been borders on Germany, Austria, Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. This has been the first solution suggested by the EU faced with the migration crisis. They tried to not put the solution on each individual state, but we saw that in the end, EU member states each did its own. And what I would like to show you now is the second solution that was suggested by the EU, since the re-establishment of border controls meant the collapse of the Schengen area. Here is another piece of news that I would like to show you. I cannot find it, but as I said, the first solution was not successful. It affected both immigrants and EU member state citizens, and so the EU tried to reinforce the outside borders. Instead of going towards finding the exception, they tried to reinforce an integrated management of outside borders. But this solution did not start with the migratory crisis. In fact, it started with the Council of Tampere in 1999, where it was highlighted that there was a need to reinforce cooperation among border control services of EU member states. This need was even more acute after 9/11, where there was hysterical reactions by the whole world, and some member states headed by Italy, they decided to create a European border and coast guard. The EU Commission tried to have more of a consensus, more of a common solution. At that time, they decided to go with the easiest option for sovereignty of member states, and they tried to do a new way of cooperation. The result of this cooperation was the creation of a common body of experts in outside borders, and now there are some centers in Germany, in Greece, in Italy, in Spain, like the control of terrestrial borders, of maritime borders, risk analysis center, and training for border police, for instance. This was not a permanent structure, and the EU wanted to have a body that would day on the daily basis, on a daily work, and since in 2004, 10 new countries were coming into the EU, FRONTEX was created. This was done in Warsaw. FRONTEX was created in Warsaw in 2004, and it does not have its own resources, its own technical resources. They take in their own work is to have a more integrated system of management of outside borders. They do joint operations like Operation ERA, Poseidon, Indalo, and different coast guards coordinate themselves, so they try to hinder immigrant flux, or they try to rescue immigrants. Some of the other roles are risk analysis, which consists on investigating what are the transition countries for these immigrants, what are the departing points, and what is the way that mafias work in order to do work on the field. Other roles are to help EU member states that face an exceptional situation, flooded with immigrants, and to coordinate their return operations of immigrants towards their own countries. In 2005, they did the ERA operation, a joint operation. It was done on the Atlantic Ocean, where many immigrants were arriving in small boats, cayucos, to the Canary Islands. But it received a lot of criticism for the infrastructure that they have, how slow they were, and the results. It took them a long time to have the Coast Guards coming to the Canary Islands, and then the RABITs were created, the Rapid Border Intervention Teams. In English is, as we said, Rapid Border Intervention Teams, and what these did, there were mechanisms that for limited time they had a swift intervention, and since the problem was that they were very slow in general, these RABITs helped gain time. Out of the 13 states that they committed to helping Spain, only a few in the end helped it, and so the commitment of the EU with FRONTEX was not as strong as it was in the regulation. More and more joint operations were implemented, but there were many critical voices because human rights of immigrants were not being respected. And so a second assessment of FRONTEX regulation was done, and it had two blocks of news, one with regard to human rights and another one with regard to operational questions. Up until then, there was no mention of the Charter of Human Rights, the European Convention of Human Rights, and this regulation created a code of conduct so that Coast Guards would have to take into account rule of law principles, respect of fundamental rights. There is a specific agent for human rights, so he makes sure that these human rights are respected while operations are being done. And these are the main changes and amendments with regard to human rights. With regard to operative questions, they introduced some new ideas. They decided to give help to those states who were faced with emergency situation, especially for those countries that were faced with specific pressures. This was good for Germany. Germany, Greece, and Spain that were overflowing with immigrants, and this role was set into the mandate of FRONTEX. Then the European Border and Coast Guard, which is the EBCG, was created instead of the RABIT, and they're made of the Coast Guard by the recipient country, the host countries, and also some other EU member Coast Guards. So there are three different categories of Coast Guards, and they make together this European Border and Coast Guard that were created in 2011. In 2015, the previous solution, as we saw, did not have any success, as you could see in Greece, and so the European Immigration Agency requested for something to be more efficient and independent of FRONTEX, and that is how the European Border and Coast Guard was created in 2016. Some people call it FRONTEX Plus because there are no real news or novelties with regard to what FRONTEX was before. Some competences were reinforced, but there has not been competence delegation of the EU member states onto the European Union, so that the EU has its own body. So we have the same situation where the EU member states give their coast guards for just individual operations, but EU member states want to preserve their sovereignty with regard to outside borders. But here are some of the news, some of the novelties of this Frontex Plus, or whether this European Border and Coast Guard body is something new. The first block of novelties introduced by this body was the protection of fundamental rights. In 2013, the European Ombudsman launched a report where he criticized the lack of an internal mechanism in Frontex to denounce and report the violation of human rights. So those immigrants who had their fundamental rights violated, they could not go to that organization itself to complain about that violation. And so this was created, a mechanism to report violations of the rights of immigrants during joint operation. What was the problem with this? There is still some loopholes, because in case of a negative solution, these immigrants will not be able to appeal to any EU bodies. So, as we see, there are some gaps and some loopholes, but many steps are being taken. Another novelty is an imposed solidarity, even though the name is a little bit tricky, because solidarity should never be imposed. But as I said before, ERA operation had some problems because EU member states did not live up to their commitments, and out of the 750 coast guards that had been requested, not many were given to Frontex, and so resources were scarce. And so now these European Border and Coast Guards requires mandatory amount of coast guards to be there. This is the article that you can see on the image. The contingent of swift reaction will be a permanent body that works for the agency. To do so, each member state yearly will give the agency a certain amount of coast guards. The total amount is 1,500. Up until now, as we said, 1,500 coast guards have border guards have been given to Frontex, but as I said at the beginning, the European Guard has no resources on its own. It is mandatory for EU member states to give them to Frontex, but it depends on each EU member state. Last but not least, the third block of novelties, and I think is the most important, is further integration. There is no explicit way of saying it in this regulation of Frontex, but we can read among the lines that the reestablishment of outside borders is there, but now EU member states have less roles and the EU do more. And I explain. The way it was done before, that it was used in Greece, meant that an assessment had to be done for a whole year, then some recommendations were drafted, and if that member state did not fulfill them, then the Council recommended for other EU member states to reestablish their national borders. With this new way, in case an EU member state is not properly managing its outside borders, an executive decision takes things into its own account, and the borders have to be set up again, and so a year is saved, and that way no unilateral decisions have to be made by the EU member states. I'm talking about further integration because the EU member states now need to comply with the EU Council decision. Before, borders were not controlled by the EU. All they had to do was to maybe comply with a recommendation. But now the EU, little by little, is assuming more competences in outside border control issue, and we're trying to have a more general management of the outside borders. Here is a solution. Here are the solutions that the EU took and how they respect or know the values of solidarity and protection of human rights in the EU. The reestablishment of border controls was just a unilateral decision, but the creation of an integrated system of management of outside borders is a better solution. It's not just a contention measure, the first one that was taken, but it also affects the free movement of people that us as European citizens have. And with this new situation, the European Border and Coast Guard, they're just protecting the outside borders. The re-establishment of border controls also symbolize the lack of trust among member states. Is an example of lack of solidarity, is an individualistic solution. However, this new measure oblige member states to do cooperation and solidarity among themselves and respect of human rights, and they think about a joint solution to the migratory crisis. With regard to the respect of human rights, there is still a lot of work to do, even with this new European Border and Coast Guard body. But more and more, they're trying to respect human rights of immigrants, and they want to have a joint solution, a global solution. Here are my conclusions. Despite the fact that the European Border and Coast Guard seems to be new, I said at the beginning that it all began after 9/11. Cooperation, consensus was the solution that was suggested, but time has demonstrated that cooperation at that level is not enough, and we need an implication of the European Union and EU member states besides mere cooperation. So it is essential that solidarity is imposed onto member states through technical means or human means. And also, I think that this European Coast Guards is here to stay, but in the future, they need to have the same efficiency as the national borders were suppressed a few decades ago. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. You save a few minutes, so we have plenty of time for discussion. Thank you very much. A very important subject. One remark. In that case, as in others, the solution is more integration. If you look at financial crisis, the solution was more integration in financial sphere. It is exactly the same. First, in the first case, the worst one, you come back to a national solution. The second, you go to more integration. You have nothing in the middle. So I want just to ask you a question. You spoke about violation of human rights or the bad treatment. Can you explain what were the general cases of that problem?
Complaints came from NGOs, and in particular, the biggest complaint was because the FRONTEX agents violated the principle of non-devolution. During the joint operations, immigrants were rescued in the sea, and instead of taking them to a safe haven, they were taken to the origin country. So the principle of non-devolution principle was violated. That's the most common and most severe complaint. Perhaps it's not that important as security, but this is the right that was violated more often.
But to fight against that kind of problem, you have to have some inspectors, etc. They are on the boat, but are they of the same nationality than the team of the boat, or are they? Because if people cannot have somebody to complain, what can they do?
In theory, as I explained before, there is a code of conduct that has to be followed by all the border guards that participate in operations. And there is an agent who's in charge of fundamental rights, who has its own team, and who is supposed to have a representative in the joint operations. The problem is that this novelty about the mechanism of complaint is from 2016. Before, they didn't have any form, migrants didn't have any form to denounce these situations, and what is expected is that with this mechanism they will be able to complain and to present in writing their complaints. But I am in agreement with you that it is quite difficult to prove the non-violation, or rather the violation of non-devolution principle if there's no inspectors. But then again, there's the problem of lack of resources in Frontex. They would need more personnel, both guards and those who protect regulations and norms.
But the boats come from national maritime forces. So you have national boats from maritime forces that are the Coast Guards.
Teams are made up of border guards from the member state, which is the host, in this case Greece, border guards from guest member states like Germany, for instance, and others who are seconded by the agency, by the state and by the state member states. And they can be on a boat that can be the property of Greece, of Spain, Germany, or the one that has given the technical means. But boats don't belong to the agency. They are national boats from the national maritime authorities, because the European Guard has no means of its own.
So I think on the floor we are always. Please.
Gracias por la presentación. Quería preguntar.
Thank you for the presentation. I wanted to ask you, this Coast Guards is dealing with human beings, no matter where they come from, because I suppose there must be social workers, psychologists, or do they have a profile of policeman or soldier? And as a brief reflection, I believe, according to what you have said, that both in the first solution of the internal borders establishment and in the second, the integrated system of borders, the problem is how to manage a castle, be it bigger or smaller. But it is a fortress that has to be defended to avoid people from outside to come into the castle. Thank you for your question. the legal nature of these people who are in charge of managing borders. They are not psychologists or volunteers. They are coast guards who have executive competences in their member states, in the sense that they have to use coercion, they can carry arms, they wear uniform. They belong more to a security force than a humanitarian corps. And regarding the management, whether is the management of a fortress or a castle beyond solving the migration problem, I am in total agreement. What has been done is that instead of trying to resolve unilaterally the migration problem, to try and find a joint solution, which has its origin in the fact that EU acts as a state because it has no internal borders. What has been done is to act, taking into account that there is a common outside border, to act in a joint manner. But I agree with you that the solution to the migratory crisis is not to create a Coast Guard force, but rather, as I was saying before, to take into account the countries of origin or control the transit countries' mafias. But the solution that has been made is to pass from an individualistic to a community solution rather than any change in paradigm.
Two questions in one. First, you have a policy. What policy? Second, who is going to make the policy respected? The men who are going to make the policy respected are Coast Guard. They obey. So you distinguish all of the Coast Guard and the policy. If you have a change in policy, the Coast Guard have to respect. That's military force obey. But if you change the orders, change the policy. Other question.
Does it work? Yeah, okay. I think what we need is an integrated concept, isn't it? It's basically everything related to common security and defense policy. That implies a coherent and common approach just to keep things stable outside the borders. That also applies safeguarding the external borders of the European Union. And then, again, we have to ask ourselves, wouldn't it make sense to establish, let's say, a European border guard, coast guard, with, well, rights of policemen, European policemen, just to avoid the sort of national, different national approach and different national traditions within these police forces, border police forces, with common European standards. I mean, that could be a way out. I've myself been dealing with this topic for quite a while, and the more I think about it, the clearer it becomes that we need this sort of a rather intertwined, complex approach. It will not safeguard or will not bring us back into paradise, but at least it is a step forward.
Thank you very much for your intervention. First of all, the European Border and Coast Guard falls into the Schengen, the freedom of movement policy. So it is not within the common security and external policy. Isn't probably not the same, the one of liberty and the one of security. However, we are in agreement that it is necessary and integrated and joint approach. The problem, from my point of view, is to have eliminated internal borders before having a clear mind that there were outside borders on which to act. First of all, thank you very much for your presentation. I wish to excuse myself for my lack of knowledge because I belong to a totally different area of research. I wanted to ask a question that may sound naive. I wonder why, instead of looking for a solution how to control and protect borders, we don't change our approach, and instead of protecting, we would speak about integrating migration into our cultures. As Sofia Corradi was saying before, her problem was to make people understand that one culture would not pollute the other. The Italian student that went to Germany or to France was not going to pollute their cultures. From my innocent point of view, why we are not looking for a solution to integrate this migrant influx? It's not an innocent question. I have also asked that myself. I don't have a reply. I have a certain reply, though. I was talking to my colleagues before. There is a theory of securitization of migration. It is seen migration as a problem of security. And this is happening since 2000, 2001, the September 11 attacks, and there is this relationship between migration and security, which is in the European discourse, in the national discourse, in France or in Britain that has left the EU. The problem comes from relating both things, migration and security. The result, the result has been this one, and this is what I'm presenting. It may not be the best problem to tackle this. Should be probably a more integrative solution, taking into account human rights. And this is affecting also solidarity between member states, which are quarreling for not assuming their own responsibilities. If we are unable to be in agreement among countries that are similar and belong to the same organization, it is more difficult if we refer it to outsiders. So to me, this is the wrong way to proceed, but this is the one that I have come up in my research.
Because I do see your point, and I'm really on your side emotionally. But on the other hand, I mean, you have to sell this concept to the people. And I'm definitely sure you won't get a majority for this approach. That's the basic problem. Because, and to a certain extent, the people in the member states of the Union, they are right when they claim security for their own sake as well, when they want, when they want security for themselves. Social security and felt sort of physical security. I'm not talking about sort of objective facts or so with regard to statistics. But the problem is, as can be seen right now in the election results, in the polls, that there is a growing problem with regard to this sort of, to a certain part of the population which simply does not accept the development as it is. An integrated concept also contains, at least in my understanding of this thing, a sort of immigration concept. I mean, in Germany, we are working hard to develop such a concept. I think just the other day I read a statistics and related to the population. Germany right now is immigration country #2 worldwide. I was surprised myself when I read the statistics because I always considered Canada, the US, and Australia as immigration countries. But it is a challenge for the people, and simply to open the borders is not a solution either, I think. So what we definitely need is this really sort of integrated concept with controlled migration, following a certain, set of rules, how to do it. Europe is not able to solve the problems of the world by simply inviting all peoples from peoples from countries with civil war conditions to come over. I mean, this would create civil war here. And then we are in a position to take care of the people who are already living here in Europe as well. And they've got their rights as well. That may sound a bit harsh and cynical, but I think that's the reality as it is right now.
But this subject is quite close to me because I am I am not like I am an immigrant in Europe, and my partner is Syrian, and he okay he came as well. So sorry. I need to.
Don't worry, keep calm.
Maybe later.
Sorry.
Well, you.
I will speak later, sorry.
Okay. Where is the microphone? Oh, yes.
I think the debate is very interesting and is showing, Teresa, that the topic you have chosen touches the hearts of the conflict of values in the European Union. I think that the question made by Jairo is quite refined. It's always useful to have a philosopher in the room to question the profile of those who are guarding the borders. Following the thread of what was being spoken or said by the previous speaker, I have a couple of questions which is probably, or which are a bit more away from the legal topics. Do measures or the debate on international development cooperation as an impact against desperate migration? My hypothesis may be incorrect, but a controlled migration that has been alluded to is not possible unless we have a framework in which migration is not desperate. Well, that is not a reality, and international cooperation for development plays an important role, and the fight in favor of international equity, perhaps what provokes is more dangerous paths of migrants. And I'm not sure whether this is being touched upon. It's not a matter of making walls higher, but trying to avoid or to limit the drama in the need to have the displacement. And as a Spaniard, I can see that political authorities in Spain are using the migration pressure as a reason to carry out in a very slow manner the legislation of pacts with Greece and with Italy. Maybe my data are incorrect, but the ones I have from the Spanish Commission of Aid to Refugees in Spain, in 2016, 10,000 people have arrived in irregular condition. In Italy, 200,000, in Greece as well, 200,000. So the pressure made by Spain to those states of the Union, if it is translated into norms, it really brings about legal irrationality. The objective fact, and these are the data I have, maybe you have other data, is that we are joining the locomotive that is not really ours. And something that you have spoken about mechanisms, the European Ombudsman managed to get a claims mechanism, but not of appeals. Is that correct? So that norm is null, since it is against the international treaties. I don't know what Bettina is, maybe you know more, but if the European Union has signed the European Convention of Human Rights, the right to appeal is a necessary right in all administrative proceedings. If not, the European Union should have to refine or simply to remove it from the legislation. I don't know whether you have any references about this. Thank you for your questions. You have asked three things. I try to follow the order. References to international development cooperation instead, so that no, in FRONTEX or the European Border and Coast Guard, it is assumed as a mechanism of the EU to tackle the problem in an executive manner within the external borders, but as a solution which has to do with EU, not mechanisms of cooperation with third states, unless in the return operation, which has to do with the rescue, or the activity of Frontex. I don't know if I'm making myself clear. So the only cooperation with third states is how to return those migrants that are rescued in the sea back to their countries of origin. So it is not a matter of how to avoid them to leave, but how to return them once they have left. Secondly, the Spanish approach regarding settlement and resettlement, the arrival of migrants in Italy and Greece compared with Spain is absolutely huge, the difference. In the Canary Islands, there was an important influx. That is why ERA was implemented, but most of them arrive in Greece, in Italy, and also through Malta. The problem with resettlement and relocation, the mechanism for relocation is not binding, legally binding for member states. It depends on the state's will to accept the quota of migrants, but there's no way to force any member state to assume that quota. That is the problem why Germany is responding correctly to the relocation, whereas other countries like Spain are trying to avoid their responsibilities. There was a proposal by the Commission. I'm not sure the document that was trying to make it binding, the act through which the distribution of migrants was made, in whose case it would have different legal terms, because it could be appealed in the European Court or economic sanctions, etc. But so far, the responsibility is assumed by certain countries and others simply avoid their responsibility. And the third question, can you remind it, please, to me?
Sí, el mecanismo.
Appeal, the conflicts of the non-existent appeal proceeding. So far in my research, in the thesis, I haven't really reached that level, the appeal mechanism. But if Bettina confirms, there's no appeal mechanism. So it is a lacuna of the mechanism. Is no there's no question. There's no validity in complaining if there's no appeal procedure. There will be supposedly appeal cases, so that the European Union has to respond, if that is right.
Two remarks, and I've been just wondering whether you considered these in your thesis or in your paper. So the first remark is, okay, migration is not a novel phenomenon, no? And the EU has been dealing with migration issues for some time now, but not in very, as you said, organized and, you know, joint way. So this made me think that at least like 10 or 15 years ago, when the migrants were arriving on Italian coasts, the EU was providing funds to Italy to make, as they call them, collection centers, but the receiving centers for the migrants arriving to the coast. But unfortunately, these funds were not managed by, let's say, the local government, but from the ministry, and were distributed to the selected NGOs. And 10 years ago, I raised this question in one of the meetings with the DG Home Affairs, because I worked in Italy with migrants and diaspora organizations. And I said, wouldn't it be best if you include directly immigration population living in Italy or elsewhere, you know, in dealing with this crisis, helping you bring these people in and, you know, helping them to integrate in the country because they were going elsewhere. But we were talking about, you know, minor quantities of people. And of course, this is on the one hand. The second issue that, that I wanted to raise is that in the first part of your presentation, you mentioned that there were a series of countries who first responded in a negative way, let's say by closing their internal borders when the migration so-called crisis started. So I remember also during the 1990s in the war in the Western Balkans, for instance, if we take example of Sweden, Sweden was one of the countries who received most of the refugees from the war in the Balkans. And I know it's often raised, you know, in the discussion on this topic, but a lot of them were also Muslims, and this didn't pose any problem to the society. Of course, it shouldn't be a problem. But today, if you look at the societal attitudes towards the immigration in Sweden, it's completely different. Because during the 1990s, the society was much open for immigration. So my question to you is whether you consider this kind of past experiences with managing migration crisis, the capacity of a host country to receive migrations, and the history of country receiving migration after a major global crisis as the war in the 1990s or other different kind of crises.
Please, can you repeat the first question? I have very clear your presentation, but not the question you're asking.
Did you in any way consider how the civil society, local diaspora organizations and civil societies can be better included in this, let's say, a global kind of approach toward managing and, you know, migration so-called crisis? So the local civil societies, societies in general on the local level, and, you know, civil society. Yeah.
I haven't dealt with that topic which you pose in your question. I'm seeing it as an institutional and normative level in the EU. I have taken into account the NGOs when looking at the problems related to fundamental human rights, but the way in which they could be integrated culturally, I haven't taken into account that part. I don't know whether the politicians' opinion is a reflection of the civil society in the sense that they don't want to hear about migration, or whether it responds to electoral interests, the idea of security versus migration, or whether, I mean, it should be researched with people in these civil society organizations and how they are responding to it. I know that in Spain, in the issue of relocation, there are certain places that have volunteered their communities, they have volunteered to host a number of migrants, so as to force the government, the national government, to assume the part of quota. But it hasn't been successful so far because the government, the state government, is not so close to those ideas. People in certain municipalities, if we know the subsidiarity model of the European Union could also be applied to the closer level to the citizen, local level, but in this case it's not being done like that. Because as I say, municipalities are sometimes volunteering to accept migrants and the state is not facilitating that process. And as to the second question, I think it is very interesting, your note. Migration is nothing new. There have always been migration in the European Union, and precisely because of that, the European Union is characterized by movements, mostly internal. It has been more open to internal movements rather than from outside. Well, when they were small quantities and control, there was no problem. But when there is a massive move and without any control, when people see a law and order threat problem. But I will take into account what you say in the sense in which you have approached Sweden in the Balkan migrant wave compared with now when they're not having the same attitude towards the migrants that come from Syria. Sorry about this. I have two questions. The first one, does really function that approach? Is it really that the number of migrants is diminishing thanks to the type of policies that are being implemented? If you're trying to stop migration, are the measures being successful? And secondly, talking of migrants' policies are protection, I have seen it on a daily basis. There are attacks to migrants. I have been assaulted at least 7 times because I was either migrant or woman in Berlin. And I am really worried because political discourse has a reaction in population. So I am worried. I am not the most vulnerable population because I am legally established in Germany. I am a scholar, but there are other people who are in much worse situations. What can happen to them? Perhaps not right now, but when the problem grows. What difficult questions you ask, which are far from my field of research, but it is interesting for the debate, and it allows me to see things more from a less legal point of view and more human. Whether the European Border and Coast Guard is functioning. It's only on for about a year. What they have been trying to do is to make countries comply with their obligations and to give the means for the force. And the information from the EU is that this guard is groups that are better controlled because they know where they come from, where they're going to. There are more protection means, but I don't think migration has been reduced. From the time in which conflicts and wars exist in countries of origin, migration is going to continue. What is changing is the way in which it is being managed, and that human rights are better respected. Because before, with the previous regulations, they were in the hands of the policeman or the Coast Guard wanted to do without any reference about an emergency situation of a migrant's boat, etc. I don't think the migration influx is being stopped, but it is rather that it's being managed differently. This is the test and error method. The regulations are being modified, but migration is not going to finish until conditions in the countries of origin are not changed. And the solution of the problem is not in Europe. I think it is in acting on the territory where migrants come from. The way in which it's being now tackled is the one that I have described. The second question, the consequences of the way in which action is being carried out, the same I was telling Anna before. She's back there. I'm not sure whether the form of replying by politicians is due to the barometer they have about the civil society, or simply that they are trying to be more protectionist regarding the problem. Elections that are being organized recently and changes in political parties perhaps are more in favor that political responses are more in tune with civil society. What we have seen in France, for instance, what we have seen with the Brexit is because their citizens have voted in favor of that because they don't want that much migration. So consequences are being seen. It's not what's going to happen in the future. This is happening already now, and it is really affecting the political situation and even the American situation with the present president, which is linked not only to migration but with economic crisis and are visible now in the present. We don't have to project ourselves to the future. Unless a miracle happens, I think in the next 4 or 8 years, the trend is going to be similar to the one we have now. I am confident that perhaps in Germany there won't be the same emergency of nationalist parties, but in France there has been an important increase, and in the United Kingdom too. The migration issue has affected elections and politicians. So from my point of view, consequences are already visible.
Question about the human rights aspect of the Coast Guard. We haven't talked about children yet. There are a lot of unattended minors on these trips. I'm doing my PhD and I teach at the University of Szeged, which is located at the Serbian-Hungarian border in the south part of Hungary, like right by the border where the receiving centers are. And we read in the news that approximately 50 children are being taken away from the border. This was statistics from the last summer. I don't know about this year's statistics, but 50 children a day taken away on their own to another collection center to another part of the country. And we cannot avoid the fact that these are children, so they don't just have the rights of refugee rights, they have the rights of a child. Like the Coast Guard, is this new Coast Guard taking that into consideration, that they're children? Because the cases were showing that they were detained, they were arrested, actual children were being arrested for 2 to 3 days, just like adults, without considering the fact that they're children. So I was wondering if there is a framework or something developed for this mechanism and this new approach of the European Union towards migrants.
The link of the European Border and Coast Guard and human rights and the rights of children is supposed to be the same as the one to the EU. The problem is the following. There is no tradition in the practical field work so that these people without training They know what type of rights are enjoyed by children and what type of regime they are under, what type of protection they are entitled to. That is, they're very complex problems, and if this is linked to the EU, it has to be linked also to the European Border and Coast Guard. But I think the problem is of training, lack of training. The legal aspect should be already solved and covered because they work for the EU and for democratic EU states. But the code of conduct of European Border and Coast Guards and all of the ones that are in charge of fundamental rights, there's still a lot of things to be developed, but only because it's a very recent project. It was just developed now, and the migratory crisis has arrived very quickly to our borders. And I hope and I wish that at present we have the resources of the European Border and Coast Guard to deal with these children and to treat them according to the rights of children. But that is theoretical, but I think in the practical terms there is still a lot of lack of training, and so some type of coordination should be done in order to train them, especially in the field of human rights and the rights of children. So my conclusion is, in theory, yes, it is clear, but in practical, well, there is still not enough awareness because they're members of the police.
One policy. You have to show people you do something, even if you are sure it's not effective. In some circumstances, you have to show I do something. So you need Coast Guard. Two, Coast Guard, European Coast Guard is better than national. And European solutions are better than national because we have a sort of effet domino. It's perfectly clear. So you need, for one time, to have Coast Guard, but also to prove solidarity with neighbors of the European Union, but inside. So if you discuss on one side of the problem, you're not solving. You need to have a global side and to play all the notes of the piano at the same time and to modulate the discourse in function of the people in front of you. We can speak about anything. We can here say what we want, but it's not always the time. It's not also the same. So, we can stop. Everybody, nothing more. Thank you very much. It's a very interesting paper. Nice discussion. Good.